A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
A 97% drop in shipping traffic through the Strait of Hormuz is not just a statistical outlier, it is a systemic shock to the global nervous system. It is the kind of number that, in any other era, would be the only thing anyone is talking about. But right now, on this Monday, March 23rd, 2026, it is just one signal in a literal sea of noise. We are standing at the edge of a historical precipice, watching the fog of war be replaced by something far more confusing, a data deluge.
It is the sound of the world's primary energy artery being clamped shut. Corn. Most people see that 97% number and think about their local gas station prices or the heating bill for next month. But the real story is the intelligence failure that led to it being a surprise for so many observers. We are watching the functional decapitation of a major regional power in real time. The old fog of war implied a lack of information. Today, we have too much information, most of it designed to deceive, distract, or overwhelm. The challenge isn't finding the data, it's surviving the flood without drowning in disinformation.
Today's prompt from Daniel is about how to avoid that data trap. He is asking us how to curate a high signal feed during these massive geopolitical shifts, specifically looking at the current collapse of the Iranian state following Operations Epic Fury and Roaring Lion. Daniel wants to know how to bridge the gap between emergency alerts, the kind of pings that tell you a missile is in the air, and actual, nuanced strategic intelligence that tells you why the missile was fired and who actually gave the order.
Herman Poppleberry here, and I have been living in the spreadsheets, the satellite feeds, and the situational reports for the last 3 weeks. Daniel is hitting on the most critical skill for 2026. We have moved past the era of information scarcity. We are now in the era of information sabotage. When the Iranian state began to fracture after the strike on the Tehran compound on March 1st, the strike that confirmed the death of Ali Khamenei, the noise floor did not just rise, it exploded. We are seeing a transition from traditional containment to a total functional decapitation, and if you are relying on a standard social media feed, you are essentially trying to drink from a fire hose filled with salt water.
It is a weird paradox. You would think that with the internet connectivity in Iran collapsing to roughly 4% of normal levels due to the winter uprising and the subsequent IRGC crackdowns, there would be less noise. But the vacuum is being filled by everyone else's speculation. We have gone from containment to functional decapitation in less than a month. How do we distinguish between the breaking news noise, the first to post, culture, and the structural intelligence that actually tells us where the pieces are falling?
The transition happened on February 28th. That was the pivot point. Before that, the West was playing a game of reactive containment. Since Epic Fury and Roaring Lion launched, the paradigm shifted to proactive dismantling. The gap Daniel is talking about is the space between an app telling you a missile was launched and a report telling you why that missile failed to hit its target because of specific maintenance backlogs in the IRGC supply chain. One is a notification, the other is intelligence. If you want to understand why the Strait of Hormuz is empty, you have to look past the headlines of closure and look at the breakdown of command and control.
I suspect most people are addicted to the notification. It gives you that hit of adrenaline. But if you're trying to understand the power vacuum left by the death of Ali Khamenei, a notification that there is smoke over Tehran does not help you. You need to know if that smoke is coming from a protest in the bazaar or a tactical strike on a specific command node in the northern compounds. Herman, you've developed a framework for this. Let's walk through it, because I think people are desperate for a filter.
That distinction is what separates a casual observer from someone who can actually predict the next 48 hours. We have to look at the 5-pillar curation framework. This is how professional analysts filter the garbage. The first pillar is primary source documentation. I am talking about raw satellite imagery from providers like Maxar or Planet Labs. When the IRGC claimed that Operation True Promise 4 successfully struck the US-UK base at Diego Garcia back in February, the breaking news accounts ran with it. But the high-signal analysts waited for the Maxar passes. They saw 0 impact craters. They saw an empty sea. That is the difference between a claim and a fact.
You are also a big fan of the geolocators on social media, but even they get fooled, don't they? I remember seeing footage last week that was supposedly from the winter uprising in Isfahan, but it turned out to be from a protest in 2022.
That is where the second pillar comes in, which is methodological transparency. A high-signal source will show their work. They will say, "We believe this is Isfahan because the minaret in the background matches these coordinates, but we are only 60% certain of the timestamp because of the shadows." If a source just posts a video with a caption like, "Iran is falling," without explaining how they verified it, you should discard it immediately. It is junk mail. Look for the analysts who use tools like Conflictly for geographic visualization. They map events in 4 dimensions: latitude, longitude, altitude, and time. If a video doesn't fit the map, it doesn't enter the feed.
It feels like the third pillar, linguistic and geographic expertise, is where most Western media fails. They wait for a translation, and by the time the translation is out, the context has been bleached away. It sounds like we are moving toward a more technical version of trust, but verify. I want to go back to something Daniel mentioned about avoiding Western editorial filters. He brought up Parsec.
Parsec is essential because it is a Persian language aggregator. Because you need to understand the regime's internal logic to anticipate their next move. If you only read Western analysis, you might have missed the significance of the strike on Bandar and Zali on March 18th. To a Western observer, it was just another port strike. But if you were monitoring the Persian language narrative through an aggregator like Parsec, you would see the absolute panic regarding the disruption of the Iranian-Russian trade corridor in the Caspian Sea. For example, the nuances in how the protesters are addressing the IRGC versus the regular army. The Artesh tell you everything about where the defections might happen. You don't get that from a translated headline.
And the fourth pillar is the absence of emotive language. This one is my favorite because it is the easiest to spot. If the report uses words like shocking or unmitigated disaster or heroic resistance, it is not an intelligence report. It is a narrative. Real intelligence is dry. It is boring. It says, shipping traffic through the Strait of Hormuz has decreased by 97%. It does not say, the global economy is screaming in pain. When you see a mode of adjectives, your brain switches from analysis mode to empathy mode, and that is exactly when you become vulnerable to propaganda.
The fifth pillar is historical context. This is the one that prevents you from overreacting to every single development. When Mojtaba Khamenei, pronounced Moji Ba was named successor on March 8th, the talking heads were all saying it was a seamless transition of power. But if you had the historical context of the internal friction between the IRGC and the traditional clerical establishment, you knew that transition was built on a foundation of sand. That is why the reports from March 21st suggesting Mojtaba is now incapacitated or severely injured were not a total surprise to people who were watching the right signals. They knew the old guard wouldn't just roll over for the sun.
You mentioned the March 21st reports. This is where it gets really heavy for the next few hours. We are currently at the tail end of the 48-hour ultimatum issued by President Trump on March 21st. The demand was for Iran to fully open the Strait of Hormuz or face the destruction of its domestic power plants. If you are following the 5 pillars, Herman, how are you looking at this ultimatum right now?
I am looking at the technical feasibility of the threat versus the internal capability of the Iranian state to comply. Right now, the power vacuum is being filled by Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, Ghali BAHF, and Ahmad Vahidi. Ghalibaf is the parliament speaker, a hardliner but a pilot, a man who understands logistics. Vahidi is a commander who thinks in terms of asymmetric warfare. These are not diplomats. They are men who view any concession as a death sentence. So, the signal I am looking for is not a press release from the Iranian Foreign Ministry. I am looking at SOC radar for signs of increased cyber activity targeting regional infrastructure. That is a leading indicator of how they intend to respond.
So instead of waiting for the official word, you were looking at the digital exhaust of their military preparations.
The digital exhaust is much harder to fake than a speech. SOC radar tracks the cyber dimension. If we see a spike in scanning activity against desalination plants in the Gulf or the electrical grid in Riyadh, we know the IRGC is preparing a kinetic or cyber counterstrike. That is a high return source. It tells you what they are doing, not what they are saying they might do. We also have to look at the winter uprising geography. Conflictly shows us that the current unrest is decentralized. It is happening in Sistan and Baluchistan, in Kurdistan, and in the oil-rich Khuzestan province all at once. This isn't a localized riot in Tehran, it is a systemic collapse of the regime's ability to project domestic power.
And that connects back to the Strait of Hormuz. If the workers in Khuzestan are on strike or the pipelines are under sabotage, the oil isn't moving anyway, regardless of whether the strait is open or closed in a legal sense.
Precisely. The 13% spike in global LNG prices is the market pricing in the reality that the Iranian state can no longer guarantee the security of its own infrastructure. Most people think the strait is closed because of a deliberate naval blockade, but the deeper intelligence suggests it is closed because the shore-based anti-ship missile batteries are currently under the control of fragmented IRGC units that are no longer answering to a central command in Tehran. It's a broken arrow scenario on a massive scale. That is a much more dangerous situation than a standard naval blockade, because there is no one to negotiate with to get the ships moving again.
It's the difference between a door being locked and a door being booby-trapped by 5 different people who don't even have the key.
That is the perfect way to put it. This is why the Institute for the Study of War, the ISW, and their Critical Threats Project are the gold standard right now. They do not just give you a map, they give you an order of battle. They track which specific units are where. When they reported on March 21st that Mojtaba Khamenei was incapacitated, they didn't just guess. They analyzed the movements of his personal security detail and the sudden, total lack of communication from his office compared to previous weeks. They noticed the stagehands were panicking.
Not tensions are rising, but what is the status of the Iranian internet? Where is the IRGC moving its remaining mobile launchers? And what is the price of oil doing in response to the Hormuz deadline?
Precisely. You want to curate a feed that looks more like a military briefing and less like a news broadcast. Start with the ISW and CTP daily updates for the big picture. Use World Monitor for the real-time boom on the ground. Keep an eye on SOC radar for the cyber front, because that is where the retaliation often starts. And if you really want to be ahead of the curve, watch the prediction markets and the energy prices. Those are the places where people cannot afford to be wrong, so the information tends to be a lot cleaner. Also, watch the leadership movements.
I also find the Iran Primer from the United States Institute of Peace, the USIP, to be incredibly data-heavy. It is a bit of a shift in mindset. You have to stop being a consumer of news and start being an analyst of data. It takes more work, but in a world where the Strait of Hormuz might be a combat zone by sunset, I think the effort is justified. We are seeing the Basij organization in a leadership crisis after the deaths of Ghulam Reza Soleimani and Esmail Ahmadi. These are not just names, they are the structural pillars of the regime's internal security. If you aren't tracking these specific removals, you're missing the story of the regime's collapse from the inside out.
It is the only way to keep your head clear. When the ultimatum expires today, the headlines are going to be screaming. But if you are watching the tactical maps, you will already know if the Iranian Navy is actually posturing for a blockade, or if they are just hiding the remaining assets from the next wave of Israeli strikes. The data tells the story that the talking heads are still trying to figure out. For example, look at the munitions count. Over 10,000 munitions in 3 weeks. That is a rate of fire that traditional news outlets struggle to contextualize.
You mentioned Amwaj earlier. Why are they so critical when the internet is down to 4%?
Because Amwaj is the secret weapon for anyone following this. They provide granular, local level reporting on Iran and Iraq. Even when the connectivity dropped, Amwaj was still finding ways to get reports out from their contacts in the various ministries and on the streets of Tabriz and Avaz. First, the Critical Threats Project's Iran Update. It is the best daily deep dive you will find, period. They break down the tactical, the political, and the strategic. Second, get familiar with an OSINT aggregator like Signal Cockpit. It takes a minute to learn the interface, but seeing the geolocated pins drop in real time is a game changer. It removes the middleman between the event and your eyes. Third, follow the financial proxies.
The defection rate. If the local police stop shooting, the regime is done. It doesn't matter how many missiles they have in a silo in the desert if the guy holding the gate key walks away.
We saw it in 1979, and we are seeing the early tremors of it now. But you won't see a headline that says defection rate at 12%. You have to piece it together from geolocated footage of abandoned checkpoints and reports from Amwaj about local commanders refusing orders to deploy against the winter uprising. It's about synthesis, not just consumption.
You want to see the panic in their own words, not the sanitized version on the evening news. We are replacing our generic news alerts with RSS feeds from the ISW, the Critical Threats Project, and the Iran Primer. We are using Conflictly for maps and SOC radar for the cyber dimension.
If the state media is saying all is well, but the internal IRGC channels are discussing the loss of the Bandar Anzali port as a catastrophe, you know exactly where the pressure point is. The speed of social media is an illusion of progress. It is often just the speed of disinformation. True intelligence takes a few hours to bake. In a conflict like this, being first is often the same as being wrong.
If he doesn't appear soon, the transition to a full IRGC military junta might be complete before the week is out. Before we wrap up, I want to thank our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes while we navigate this data storm. The markets are already pricing in the LNG spike, but the human cost of a total power failure in a country of 85 million people is something that most analysts are failing to even quantify.
That is the second order effect that people miss. It's not just about the missiles, it's about the water pumps, the hospitals, and basic survival during a winter uprising. If the power goes out, the internet connectivity doesn't just stay at 4%, it goes to 0. The darkness becomes literal. Stay objective and keep your data clean. The truth is in the coordinates. If Grossi reports that inspectors are being withdrawn, or if they are reporting a loss of continuity of knowledge at the nuclear sites, that is a massive red flag. It means the regime has stopped caring about international norms because they are in survival mode.
It's another stagehand to watch. If the inspectors are leaving, the building is on fire. Herman, we focused a lot on the technical side, but what is the takeaway for the average person who just wants to know if the world is ending?
Treat your attention like a finite resource. If you spend it all on the loud, speculative talking heads on cable news, you won't have any left for the deep, quiet analysis that actually matters. Daniel's prompt is a reminder that we are all our own intelligence officers now. We have to build our own agencies because the traditional ones are often too slow, too filtered, or too tied to a specific political narrative. It is a discipline. It is like a workout for your brain. You have to check the maps, read the dry reports, and cross-reference the claims, but the reward is a sense of clarity. You aren't surprised when the Strait of Hormuz traffic drops because you saw the signals weeks ago. You aren't panicked when a leader is reported incapacitated because you already knew who the successors were and what their limitations are.
It's about moving from a state of constant shock to a state of informed anticipation. We actually covered some of the foundational theory on this back in episode 944, where we talked about the architecture of information and how it shapes our perception of global conflict. It is worth a revisit if you want to understand the psychological side of why we are so drawn to the noise in the first place. Our brains are wired for the adrenaline of breaking news, but our survival depends on the boring intelligence.
It's a bit like choosing the salad over the donut, corn. The donut tastes better in the moment, but the salad is what keeps you going through a crisis. And right now, we need all the mental endurance we can get. The next 48 hours are going to be some of the most consequential in modern Middle Eastern history. Whether the Iranian state survives in any recognizable form is an open question. The functional decapitation is nearly complete, but the body is still thrashing, and that thrashing can still do a lot of damage to the global economy.
We will be watching those signals closely. If you want to track this along with us, we've put together a list of the RSS feeds and tools Herman mentioned. Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes. And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power our analysis. If you are looking for those links to the ISW, Amouage, or Conflictly, you can find them all at myweirdprompts.com.
You can also find our full archive there, including episode 1117, which tracked the initial site trep of the joint operations. If you are finding this helpful, a quick review on your podcast app really does help us reach more people who are trying to make sense of all this noise. Stay grounded in the data, everyone.
This has been My Weird Prompts. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and we will talk to you next time.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts.